Welcome to everybody. Fantastic to have you with us today for our 6th ARI Legacy Seminar. This series is celebrating the fact that ARI is 50 years old this year. On April the 8th, we turned 50. We were opened by the Queen in April 1970. So we're now 50 and a half. And it's a really exciting time to reflect on ARI's legacy of science and contribution to biodiversity in Victoria and beyond. This is our 6th Legacy Seminar for this year. We've had obviously a series of them. They are all available as recordings on the ARI website if you want to catch up with the previous ones. The last one that we had was Lindy Lumsden talking about mammals, and before that was Peter Menkhorst. So this is number 6, and this is where we're starting to talk about the aquatic version of ARI's history. Before we get started, I would of course like to acknowledge that we are meeting on traditional lands across the country of Aboriginal people right across Australia. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders and traditional owners, past, present and emerging. And I'm joining you today from Turmoil country. So following that acknowledgement, I'd like to introduce Jono. Thank you, Jono, so much for doing the talk today. John Koehn, of course, has been with ARI for not all of the whole 50 years of ARI's history, but for a very large chunk of it, and is the obvious and really key person to be sharing this history with us. So we're grateful for your time, Jono, and we're really looking forward to this. Take it away. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much for the intro, Fern. That's great, and welcome all. It is my great pleasure and indeed an honour for me to give this presentation on behalf of ARI, and I guess the content and the topics and the presentation comes very much from my heart, and you'll see that as we progress. So let's go. This is a science talk, so I'm going to start with some stats. Remember these, it's pretty easy, but they might be the only stats you actually see in this talk, so I'll come back to them in a minute. This is where we're going to try and go over the next 45 minutes or so. I'm covering 50 years of science in that time, so it's going to be a rapid ride. So, strap yourself in. If you're doing emails, you might miss a few. If you're having lunch, well, don't be worried if you end up with some on your shirt, because I can't see that. Quickly, I'll go through who I am, and then we'll get into fisheries, fish, aquatic ecology, applied aquatic ecology, the progression that's had at ARI. So it's sort of history from then until now, then some major projects and how things have evolved over time, some of the achievements. I need to touch on technology, and then some of the things of the way we operate now with collaborations and partnerships, and where we head into the future. These categories are probably going to get a bit jumbled, but they're not quite clear cut, but hopefully you'll still get the messages. And one apology before I start trying to cover all this, there's possibly some people that sort of should be talked about and might have missed out along the way. So just hope that's okay with everybody. Okay, these are the statistics, and they frighten me a bit because the 80% is the amount of my life I've spent at ARI, and I've also been here 63% of ARI's life. So there's a fair overlap there, and that does mean that this is a fair portion of what I've done. That's a young John Koehn on the left, as you've no doubt worked out. Haven't changed much. Late 1980, I started at Snobs Creek Hatchery on a holiday job, and I was working with Dr. Phil Cadwallader, who you'll see in a little while. And in early 82, I came to Heidelberg after another short stint at Snobs Creek. And I started as a technical officer, but then had a range of positions, a range of projects, and worked my way through to actually lead what is now known as applied aquatic ecology. And of course, that section is now run by Jared Lyon. I've spent a lot of time working with other states, and for the last 30 years I've been working predominantly in the Murray-Darling Basin, not solely, but with a lot of the other state agencies. And in recent years I've actually donated some of my own time to work with FAO, Food and Agriculture Organisation under the United Nations, providing some advice for some subsistence freshwater fisheries in developing nations. And that's been a great experience working with overseas and international collaborators. So, but enough about me, and back to ARI. Most of you probably already know that ARI was opened by the Queen in 1970, and that's a photograph of her making her illustrious speech, and Sir Arthur Rylah is sitting behind her, keeping an eye on everyone, as he is there. And he was a senior minister in the Bolte government, and if you want to Google things about his life, you'll find that very interesting. But this was also set up as a real institute, and it had things like a dedicated draftsperson, some typists, a scientific editor, statistician, and a photographer. And some of these black and white photos that you see early on in the slides are from the late Jim Cooper, who was that photographer, and you know, it's a great history of some of the things that happened early on to have those photos. Okay, it's important to understand the history of pre-ARI, if you like, and the context of its formation. ARI consolidated staff from a range of sites around Melbourne, and this was the era of fishing and shooting. You can see Henry Bolte there out shooting ducks. I'm not sure if that would make the front page of the paper these days, but that's what it was. And the state agencies and acclimatisation societies were heavily into promoting salmonid fishing, so trout here and salmon. And this was, of course, the elite fisheries of the UK. There was also commercial fisheries at that time, and also heavily influenced by Rachel Carson's book, The Silent Spring. And so these sort of things got brought together into a fisheries and wildlife department, and that was after the Snobs Creek Hatchery had been well established a little over 20 years prior to that. So there was concern about all these sort of issues starting to come to the fore. And that led to the structure of the programs for ARI. So when it opened, it had a marine fisheries section, which didn't actually stay at ARI for very long. It ended up down at Queenscliff. Freshwater fisheries, which was mainly about recreational fisheries, and that was run by a young Don Buckmaster just to the right there. Marine pollution, which included freshwater pollution, and that was the chemistry sort of stuff. And to the left, you can see a very fully functioning chemistry lab with fume hoods and all sorts of, you know, analytical equipment and that sort of thing, mainly into DDT and heavy metals and pesticides, but not solely. There was also the Snobs Creek Hatchery, of course. You can see below there a young Peter Tosser looking down a microscope at some fish health issues around the hatchery procedures, and then the guys out doing some surveys in some of the lakes that they were stocking into. At this time in the early 70s, Dartmouth Dam was being constructed. You can see the construction site at the left, and that also led to a major environmental impact statement for that, of which ARI was heavily involved, and Barry Tunbridge led the aquatic side of that, which led to the first start of environmental flows, how much water would be let out of the dam. And just as a little side, an aside as to how things have happened, if you look in the left-hand corner of the construction site there, you can see an outlet tower. That outlet tower was supposed to have a variable level offtake so that the water could come out at a natural temperature. There was a big argument over this, and it got culled out of the final costings for the dam, and unfortunately the Middle River has been running cold water for our warm water native fishes ever since, and that hasn't been great. So there was a clear opportunity considered but then lost in the construction of that dam. Okay, so in the late 1970s, someone thought it'd be good to improve the fashion stakes at ARI, so they recruited 3 new scientists. First one was Peter Jackson, who bought desert boots and paisley shirts. The second was John Boomer, who looked like he's come out of the Lost Lagoon, and that's partly because he was working down at McLeod's Morass in Gippsland. And the third was a Scouser from Liverpool called Phil Cadwallader. And when they rolled up, all pretty much at the same time in late 1979, they were actually asked, what would you like to work on? Now, can you imagine walking in these days and someone saying, what would you like to work on? Anyway, they all selected relevant projects. Peter worked on river blackfish. John worked on eels, which are a commercial species. And Phil, as well as working on contributing to a lot of the native fish production at the hatchery, later on worked on Macquarie Perch, which is in Dartmouth Dam, and that's a photo of the Dartmouth Dam there. If you actually look at this photo, you see a young John Koehn just at the back of this photo. These were the first PhDs in freshwater, and they were all very fine scientists, and they all made a very big contribution. Also in the late 70s saw the carp invasion, so escapes from a farm in Gippsland into the Murray River system. And there was some recruitment around that too. To the left you see Alistair Brown, a Scotsman, and a Yank to the right, Jim Pribble. And they worked with what was formed as, to the very far right here, Carp program, which was up at Kyella out of Shepparton. So there was a dedicated carp group. And of course, carp have been an ongoing priority and subject of study at ARI. The book to the right I was involved in 2000, and more recently there's been a carp exclusion cage that Ivor Stewart won a Eureka Award for, and Ivor's also recently estimated a carp biomass for the whole of the nation, which is great work. So carp continue to be with us to this day. Also in the 1970s, one of the key programs run out of Snobs Creek, and that's where I started, had my second stint there, was Chinook salmon, and this was about fisheries into the lakes of Western districts in Victoria. And that's a photo of me in the hatching house with two of the old timers, the Quigley brothers, and the eggs are being stripped from the female into the bucket, and then they'll be fertilised. You might like to look at, I've got the standard OH&S shorts on there. I'm not sure if I was wearing thongs, but it's possible. And this program was actually sponsored by Mitsubishi, who were making cars in this country. And there was another scientist who came along after I left and actually went on a study tour of Japan. And for those of you with a keen eye, that's a young Fern Hames, who now works at ARI. And poor old Mr. Mitsubishi for this photo got the standard lab coat, and Fern's a bit more dressed up than that, so it's good to see she was taking the overseas trip seriously. But that program actually sort of launched both of our careers as fisheries scientists. If we stay with Snobs Creek for a little bit, you might notice a difference here. We're not talking about trout, although they were still being produced in the background. There had been a major upgrade to the hatchery, and all of a sudden there was breeding of Murray cod and then some other species. So these are large brood fish being inspected from these ponds, and that's some of the eggs that came out of the drums that they laid their eggs in. So it moved into native fish production. One of the other things that surprisingly came out of the hatchery was that Phil Cadwallader and Gary Backhouse produced this book. In '83 it was published, and this is a guide to the freshwater fish of Victoria. It outlines all the fish, but importantly it consolidated everything we knew at the time about all our native species, and this made a very great impact on the study of native freshwater fish in Victoria. It was very pioneering work. And this sort of followed the trends, I guess, and the public trends that were happening. If you walked into a bookshop in 1970, this is what you would see, lots of fishing books about trout fishing or salmon fishing and fly fishing and all that sort of stuff. And the current day today, there's much more concentration on native fish fishing. These freshwater fishing magazines are dominated now by catching large Murray cod and golden perch. It's been a massive shift. The other thing to note, I guess, is a lot of these fish are caught now and released. So catch and release is a really big thing for native fish, serious native fish anglers. They no longer get killed, which is a great thing. And that has been a really great change in the last decade or so, especially. And this influenced what we might study, and we've gone from studying salmonids or producing salmonids to our native fishes, and then to our small native fishes and threatened fishes, to a more holistic look at river systems and habitats, including on the floodplain and floods and wetlands and billabongs and things like that. And you'll see more about this to come, but it's certainly a much more holistic approach than when ARI started in 1970. Catching fish has also changed very much. In the early days, it was very destructive. Lots of netting, which is often not good for fish. It's often very damaging, or poisoning. So this is one of our old techos, Des Harrington, pouring in rotenone, which is a fish poison. They put a dye in with it so you can see where it goes. It goes downstream here and kills air-breathing fish, blocks their gills, and the fish end up downstream and collected in a stop net. So you can kill everything that's in a small section of stream. Very destructive, but it was the standard sampling technique at the time. If you're in an estuary or a lake or somewhere clear, you might use a seine net where you actually run around the fish and collect the fish, bring them into shore in the seine net. Or you may set a trap, which is a pike net here, in this case with a wing. You can see it set here. Fish go through the funnel, through the funnel, through the funnel, end up in the end here, which is kept above the surface of the water in case platypus or anything else get in there. A larger version of that is drum nets, which are used in the Murray system for larger fish like Murray cod, or we might use some small bait nets as well that might be put out for the smaller species. We also used overnight set lines, which are now well and truly illegal, when we started working on Murray cod, and that was as early as, or as late as, the early 90s. We did move on to safer techniques though, and the huge technological change has been electrofishing. Is very efficient, it's very low harm rates. ARI have used them for over 40 years, and they've gone from very basic bits of equipment to very sophisticated. We can have bank mounted in the back of a truck, backpack where you have a battery here as your power source, and into boats. And it's really the boat electrofishing that's our fleet of boats there that's made a huge difference. So the basics of it, if you don't know anything about electrofishing, you have a power source, in this case a generator. Here it's a battery, it's a generator on the boats. You have some very smart electronics, and some whiz-bang electronics here. And what happens is you have an anode, which is the net or the droppers on the front of the boats. The cathode here, which is the tail dragging behind, or the cathode here, which is the boat, and you end up with an electric field. Now, when you hit the power, fish get stunned, and you can collect them and hold them in a bucket or in a live well on the boat, tag, measure, whatever, and let them go again. And it's very, very safe, very, very low mortalities or even damage to fish. It's just fantastic. So you're dealing with 1,000 volts, maybe 15 amps, maybe more in the water. So what could go wrong? Well, the OH&S people make us jump through a lot of hoops. We have heart and health checks, medicals, lots of training, have to finish an exam, and also have first aid certificates. So it's now, ARI's always been at the cutting edge of this technology. It's now our sampling, our standard sampling techniques, and it's been a great assistance to us, a very, very efficient way of catching fish. So just in light of that, I'll show you a very short video as to how it works. Mostly electrofishing's only been conducted in freshwaters, but more recently we've worked with a German inventor, and we now have this machine, Grassel, that can work in estuarine and salty waters as well. And this is revolutionary technology, and it's been developed or tested by John McKenzie, Andrew Pickworth and Jason Lesky. So you turn the power on and fish get stunned. You turn the power off again and they mostly swim away, the ones that you haven't collected. So really special bit of equipment, and this is now allowing us to catch estuarine species such as bream and mulloway, as well as working in all the freshwater systems. Okay, let's go back to a timeline. In the 1980s, the trend was towards conservation. The Koehn Labor government had come in Victoria. There was a Ministry for Conservation. There was a Department of Conservation, Forests and Lands. The Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act was enacted in 1988. The first conservation protection legislation in Australia, so it was before the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act nationally. We then had a Department of Conservation and Environment that caused a split in the Fisheries Management branch, and the group at ARI was Freshwater Ecology branch, which came in with Parks, Flora and Fauna to look after the conservation, particularly of the smaller species. You'll notice conservation in these names. It's something we don't have these days, but that was the flavour of the month then. So the 90s was about trying to recover species. It was the Act. The Act, I think, actually got enacted in 1990, but the regs came in 1988. And there are 28 species and 8 aquatic threatening processes listed, as well as 1 fish community. And ARI has been involved in all of these in one way or another, particularly in writing the action statements, also writing many of the national recovery plans that you can see here for these species, so not just Victorian species, but other species across, in particular, the Murray-Darling Basin. I'm going to highlight 2 of these, trout cod and barred galaxis. Okay, so trout cod was initially having some conservation stockings. They were not very successful. They were in small streams. We then had a serious look at this, developed a population model, and you'll see Charles Todd later on, and used that to assess what the status was of existing populations. Also, what was needed in these stocking regimes to be successful, and that led to a revision of both the sites and the stocking rates in a new stocking program, and we successfully established 2 new populations in Victoria, the Ovens and the Lower Goulburn. Great conservation success stories, a couple of references there if you wanted to follow it up. But also this program ran out nationally, and so there are now populations in the Upper Murray and also throughout the Murrumbidgee in New South Wales. I guess the deal is that had funding continued, I believe that we could have delisted this species altogether. There hasn't been funding in Victoria for trout cod stocking on a conservation basis for quite some time. I think that's a shame, but it's still a very good model to look at, and it's been a very successful program. And with that in mind, we're now trying to recover Macquarie perch using the same successful approach. So we've modelled population predictions for translocations and restocking into the Ovens River, so mainly above Wangaratta. A lot of community buy-in. We've got Zeb Tonkin down here to the left, and also Jared Lyon have been leading this, but a whole bunch of regional and CMA and community members that have been involved as well. And the approach is to take some brood fish from Dartmouth and stock the fingerlings that come out of the hatcheries, and also translocate some fish from Dartmouth as well and release them in. And these are some of the predictions as to what we might expect over time with the stocking regime, and then we're monitoring to see how we're tracking against those. The predictions are working pretty well at the moment, and we're hoping that over time there'll be a self-sustaining population of Macquarie perch in the Ovens River, which would be great. Okay, I want to tell you a story about some small fish. I've titled this One Friend, and that's Tamo Radic and Two Enemies. Tamo is very interested in small fish, particularly these small galaxids. In the early days, Galaxis olidus at the top. We knew that there was barred galaxis was a different variety there that's quite appears quite different, but there were a whole lot of other questions around what was in this species complex, if you like. So Turmoil had a quick look at them and described a whole lot of other species there. So a great increase in our biodiversity of both galaxids and freshwater fish. It just shows that we need to spend time looking at these species in detail. Of course, these are small and bite-sized and get chewed up by trout, which is not good, and you very rarely find them in areas where trout coexist. Tano went and made friends with the trout people who were stocking them, and had been a bit of a blockage to try to protect the small galaxids. Went out and found all the sites and the waterfalls, went out and took some of the trout out and relocated them, and they all lived happily ever after. Well, nearly. There was a second enemy though, and that was fires. And as you all know, in 2009 and then again in 1920, there have been massive fires that have covered some of the small ranges of these species. We've ended up with catchments that look like that, and then subsequently when it rains, their habitat that look like that. So these poor fish were pretty grimy. Tamo got the same guy that he got to get the trout out to go and get these fish out. They went back to Heidelberg, rescued, got cleaned up, fed up, and sort of got themselves in good condition, waited for the habitats to improve, and then they've been released. And some of these releases have only just been in the last little while. And so again, a really good conservation story for these species. So there we go. Well done, Tamo. Okay, back to our timeline. I can't leave this bit out. The 1990s, there was a lot of turmoil in government. In the early 90s, Jeff Kennett came in. There were some fairly brutal public sector cuts. Aquatic ecology was attempted to be corporatised twice, once with ARI and once post the ARI effort. And that was followed by proposed relocation of all of the aquatic staff to Snobs Creek. I'm not really going to say any more about that, apart from the fact that it sort of went a bit pear-shaped, and we stayed at ARI, thankfully. But there are repercussions from these sorts of issues, from such government changes. And look, there was some really serious stress on people around that time, and you know, I think everyone sort of survived. I guess the real thing was, though, that all the other institutes that were being corporatised, none of them survived. None of them are available now. When we were part of Macquarie, it had 120 staff. Now I believe it's got 6 or 8. And so a lot of that skill and expertise around the marine side of fisheries and fish has been lost. I guess the good news was that we were corporatised. We ended up with a very strong, efficient business focus. We had to learn all that. We went right to the brink of actually getting corporatised, and then it didn't happen, but we kept those skills. We work on a full cost recovery basis. We're mostly externally funded, and that includes funding from the Commonwealth and outside Victoria. And we're very client focused, doing applied research. And that's been a very deliberate strategy, but a very good niche for ARI to be in. So, you know, we learn a lot of things along the way, and that has ultimately been good for ARI. So back to the science. Fish movements are very important, and there are many barriers to connectivity on our river systems. ARI has been fortunate enough to be involved in what was the tri-state fisheries team, so South Australia, New South Wales and Victoria, and they established the sea to Lake Hume Fishway program on the Murray River. This is one of the fishways being constructed. I think this is the Turrumbry one, and ARI has been involved in the design, implementation, monitoring of these. Just so you can see here, these red arrows are at entrance level. So when the water level is up, fish can come in here and they can go through these chambers, have a rest in each one, go up and down, and then come out and go across the weir, which is to our left, upstream. One of the things about these fishways is that you can actually insert a cage, such as in the middle here, and overnight you can trap the fish in there and then you can count them. So it's a way of monitoring how many fish are going upstream. Andrew Pickworth, who's a master designer and welder and cutter of steel and can work on these construction sites. So we're talking about working with hard hats and yellow cards and white cards and whatever other induction you have to have for these sites. But some major engineering stuff that fits in, and working cross disciplines has been really great job. I guess an extension to this was, I mentioned before, Ivor Stewart designed a cage where carp could come into these cages and jump and go over the top and then get trapped in a cage where all the other native fish went underneath. And so carp could actually be removed at these sites as well, so a double benefit. But again, you know, some massive engineering work that fish scientists never thought they'd probably be involved with. You can also study the movements of fish going through these fishways. So here you can see the water coming down and fish will come up through these narrow gaps. So they come up, have a rest, shoot through the narrow gap there. And these narrow gaps you can put in an antenna, insert a pit tag, which is the same as goes into your dog or cat at the vet, just inject it into the fish, and then as the fish pass through here, they get registered and come out on our database. So another smart way of using these fishways to look at fish movements in relation to flows or whatever. Of course, there's a whole lot of other barriers, and we're about trying to get fish past these barriers. Fish obviously can't jump up here, so that might be replaced with a culvert. Culverts are dark. Fish don't want to go into the dark always, so then you put a grid on the top so you let some light in, and that's some really useful work that Matt Jones has been doing, and there's a reference there. This is the entrance to the fishway at Dights Falls on the Yarra, not that far from ARI. This is another culvert where if you put in some baffles, the fish can go through what is a pretty high velocity through here. And this is a rock ramp fishway, which allows fish to work their way up in a similar way through the stream as well. So all ways of trying to help fish connect. And to understand their movements, we tag fish. That's one of the reasons you tag fish, and used to start off with putting a tag in. You tag at the start, and then you might recapture the fish, so you get 2 dot points. But using and pioneering, indeed, we were the first people to radio track or acoustically track freshwater fish in the country. You can insert a radio tag or an acoustic tag. You can send one of your top scientists out either, or you can put up towers and loggers, and you get a graph of their movement. Now, if this was a traditional tag, you have your capture point and your recapture point, and you would infer that this fish hadn't actually moved. But by being able to follow them all the time, you can see that this fish actually made a downstream and then an upstream back to its home base movement. And that probably coincided with this peak in flows, this little spike in flows here. So you get a much better, I guess, a much more consistent and a much truer indication of what the fish is actually doing. And you can come up with some really cool graphics. And this is some work that Wayne Costa's done in tagging silver perch. And so this is the daily movements of an individual fish going down the river, coming back up, and you can see we can track that alongside water temperature, water flows and temperatures here. And there's some really cool work, and there's a heap of other work being done on species such as the Australian grayling by Wayne and Frank Amstatter and Justin O'Connor. So really understanding how these fish move about. We've also done a lot of study on fish habitats. This is a great snag where a lot of Murray cod like to hang out. I think we had 3 or 4 fish there. Quantify how much wood, how far from the bank, water depth and velocity. Done the same for other species at trout cod. They're further from the bank, faster velocities. And then smart people like Adrian Kitchingman has got the maps and mapped some of this sort of habitat where the wood is. That's been done throughout much of the north of the state, and the CMAs can then use these sorts of maps to pick the spots where they might be able to enhance this habitat. So don't just go in and put more wood in everywhere, but to pick the priority spots. And this is all about habitat restoration. I mean, removal of wood's been a key threat to a lot of our river systems. ARI has undertaken the largest re-snagging program anywhere in the country. Jared Lyon led a huge team there, and over 1,000 snags got put back into the Murray River system. And this is about increasing habitats, and some really smart monitoring has indeed found that this doesn't just collect the fish around those snags, but it actually increases population. And there's Renee working with the CMA, and she's also worked with a lot of rec fishers and catchment staff in terms of replanting, which I guess is the ultimate in trying to fix habitats. Okay, environmental flows have been with us for a long time. Started off around the dams, but there's a whole lot of other things in terms of expert panels and fishers' assets, working with the other disciplines of hydrologists and geomorphologists, taking the whole of basin approach, and the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, which is trying to reallocate more water to the environment across the whole basin. So we've progressed from minimum flows into ecological requirements for spawning and recruitment and movements and queues, and now designing hydrographs. So, and with that, we're trying to model the potential outcomes of some of this work. And a report just released that we've been doing for catchments and water in Melbourne, some fantastic work in terms of VEFMAP project, massive bit of science that. We also work on invertebrates, bugs, so not just fish, monitoring, conservation, ecology. People like Di Crowther and Phil Pappas have been doing that for ages, and there's Di talking to some of the locals about burrowing crayfish. And we have a full riparian wetlands program now, which is led by Ashley Sparrow and his team, Chris Jones, Lindsay, Vivian, Di, Phil and others. And so we've got people actually looking at plants, so not just fish, but wet map program, looking at those wetlands and fishing wetlands as well, and of course, billabongs and connections to the river and stuff. So a very holistic approach. Just quickly a summary of some of the changes over time. So we've come from marine fisheries and hatcheries with pests, carp thrown in, through native species and a lot of surveys, built-in invertebrates, and gone into spawning and other ecology to tailor our environmental flows, habitats movement, recruitment, so not just spawning but actual recruitment, looking at whole of rivers. And now we're really into restoration and recovery, so fishways and re-snagging and flows, a lot of partnerships. And now we're trying to model and predict what might come, what the best options are from some of these solutions. And so that's a sort of progression, I guess, over the last 50 years. And some more general trends and changes at ARI over that time. Certainly more female staff now. It was very male dominated when I started. Lots more PhDs and qualifications and skills. Our quality of science is much better. We work elsewhere, not just in Victoria. Our business practices are better. I suspect that if you spoke to most ARI staff, they would know that what their total charge out rate per hour, per day or per month or year is. OH&S, comms, collaborations, partnerships, I'm going to talk about in a minute. Some of the things that we've decreased, we had a lot of purely technical staff. There's people are multi-skilled now. Most of our technical staff have at least got degrees or some other quals. We've moved from the natural history and the field-based work. We probably have less of that. We probably have less science research policy interactions, and that happened when policy and research was split to a purchaser-provider model in the early 80s. I don't like that. I like working together with people. We used to sit and have lunch, play cards, have beers after work every day and have conversations. We can't do that as well anymore. It's much harder. And I think we also work a lot harder, so our work-life balance has probably gone down over that time as well. Okay, this is Australia's first electrofishing team. Anik and Lauren running the boat, working on the Murray. Great boat operators, great scientists, just great part of the team. OH&S briefly, this is a picture of Ray Donald, one of the old techos working in the one of the tributaries of Dartmouth, probably around the late 70s, maybe early 80s. The only thing that I can say here is Ray is probably overdressed. He's got a cap on and he's got boat shoes on, so at least he's got 2 bits of equipment, protective equipment. It wasn't uncommon in those days to work just in a pair of shorts or a pair of shorts and thongs. It's no longer like that, thank goodness. Don't try this at home, but this is not as dangerous as it looks. We now have very capable vehicles. We have well-trained drivers. When I started, some of the fuel vehicles were even 2-wheel drives and we were getting bogged all the time and it was very dangerous. Good equipment, and it's ARI is a much safer place to work with training and equipment and risk assessments and things like that. We realise that people are our most important assets, and indeed ARI takes OH&S very seriously and has won awards for its OH&S compliance, which we need to have, especially with the field-based work that we do. Communication of our science has gone a long way. When I started, if you were in VicNat, you were doing pretty well, or a tech report. We progressed to make non-technical summaries and then into the higher journals, also into traditional and then TV, radio, and now social media, videos, providing direct management advice, and also our website. And please have a look at the website. It's looked after by Phoebe and it's got some great content on it, so have a look there. And we're also more about engaging in the public. And this is a bunch of people when we're electrofishing up on the Murray, watching fish be caught, and then have tags, radio tags inserted in them through surgery, and habitat rehab, threatened species, you name it, kids, Indigenous groups, all sorts of people involved. We also collaborate strongly across project teams with universities, worked interstate in the Murray-Darling Basin Commission, been heavily involved and very supportive of Australian Society for Fish Biology and other societies, ASL, Native Fish Australia, so working with those people. And I want to show you something I'm very, very proud of. I'm very proud of this painting that now hangs in my study. It was a present from Phil Duncan there, who's a Gamilaroi man from northern New South Wales, who works across the basin. I've never actually worked with Phil on a project, but he gave me this as a present for having helped him understand fish and flows and ecology, and talk to him about how Indigenous involvement could be improved over the journey. And we're great mates and collaborators. And you know, having in the context of this, I wish to recognise the lands of the many traditional people that I've worked on. I want to pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And that's something that was never done. That was something that was never considered when I started working in 1970, and that's a major step forward to the way that we work today. I talked about Murray-Darling Basin, and one of the things we were involved with was this native fish strategy, and it collaborated with all the agencies and the states and the scientists and the communities, particularly the stakeholders, Indigenous people and anglers, and it really changed the way that fish management happened in the Murray-Darling Basin. I'm particularly proud of being involved with that. And you might ask, well, why work outside Victoria? But you know, you get to work with the best. There's some great benefits. We increased our skills, we formed partnerships, and it provides free science to the results for Victoria. These transferable results can come back and they've been paid for by someone else. So that's part of our external workings that's lifted us to another level. Okay, a little bit about new technologies. Wayne Costa actually tagged some fish with new satellite tags in the Barwon River, and they've ended up eels, short-finned eels, in the Coral Sea. How cool is that? This is an otolith or an ear bone out of a fish. You can count the rings and count the age, but you can also look at the microchemistry and see where they're born and where they've been. Drone photos showing us a great aerial shot of some habitats, some seagrass there. And James has got a pump on his back and sampling probes, and this is collecting environmental DNA. So that should be in the near future be able to get a readout and tell us exactly what species are present. Great stuff, really great stuff. ARI has always been early adopters and has made many firsts: electrofishing, larval collection, the tracking and tagging, photos, re-snagging, marine electrofishing. So that's keeping us at the forefront of science. And just to look at the progress of technology, that book was done on a typewriter. That book in 1990 that I wrote was done without touching a keyboard, but was word processed, not by ARI, but by a contractor. We had the first mobile phones, faxes, that was what a camera looked like. GPS, fantastic, increased hugely after the Iraq War when they released or allowed more satellites to work. Echo sounders, all this is combined in a phone these days, a computing power, the internet. And let's not forget the humble battery, because that battery power has enormously increased the number of things, gear that we can use. Just quickly, that computing power can be used for statistical analysis, or also population modelling, where we convert ecology into numbers. That's Charles Todd, and you can look at the life stages and make predictions of what happens with populations, and we're using that to maximise the outcomes of environmental flows at the moment. Built on some of the latest science, which includes some of the tagging and otolith work that's shown what happens to golden perch and their populations. Okay, there are many challenges. There are serious impacts on freshwater systems. They're one of the most threatened ecosystems in the world. There's lots of work needed to manage these, especially in light of water use and climate change predictions. So we've got much reduced native fish levels that we need to try and deal with. Otherwise, we're going to be dealing with extinctions, and we want to try and avoid that. So that's for the future. Quick look at the pillars of ARI. I think we thrive on excellence, and there's a whole heap of awards. This is Simon Nicol receiving his Ashton Award for re-snagging. We've got very dedicated staff. That's Ruth Lenny and Mike Nicol, who are very quiet achievers that you mightn't know about. It's a sought after location, but they keep beavering along with all the others in the background. And there's always a lot of fun and camaraderie, including from our new staff. And this is overridden by very much a team approach, and I think it's been a great place to work with some great people. Okay, I was going to look at what our assets were to try and look towards the future, but really here they are. We've got a few boats and electrofishers, but really this is our key asset. These are our staff, and at the risk of missing out a few, I want to talk about a couple. That's Jared Lyon in the middle and Ash above, who run the section. They're supported by a leadership team, so it's very much a collaborative approach to run the place. And importantly, we've been able to recruit some new staff over the last 2 or 3 years, and there they are. And I must say, without blowing too much smoke towards these guys, they're really awesome people with awesome skills, and it's been a huge injection of energy, I guess, into ARI as well. I did look, and we've now got 23 PhDs, which is about 60% of our staff, and a quick tally is there's probably over 700 years of experience there. So I think the future for aquatic work at ARI is very, very bright indeed, with a world-class team. So well done. I want to very blatantly, before I finish, do an advert for some information that came out just last week. 2 free papers. This is my gift to you if you're interested. It's work funded by Murray-Darling Basin Authority, free to all, Marine and Freshwater Research is the journal. Their website, just look at the latest edition, and you can have those for nothing. So with that, I'd like to offer my thanks to all those people I've worked with, anyone that's contributed to this. I want to thank you for your attention. Please do jump on the website, email me or contact me if you want any more info, and I'm now happy to take questions. Thanks very much.
Bravo, Jacob. Thank you so much. I think I'm echoing. I'm going to sit back a bit. Thank you so much for that terrific journey. I'm aware that I'm echoing. That's better. A fabulous journey, really, through the evolution of this work at ARI. You've taken us through the reasons for our research, the focus for our fish research, and the changes in our skills and capability over decades. And it is a truly terrific legacy of work that ARI has been doing in the aquatic space, and with many of our colleagues as well. And I encourage everybody to, as Jono recommended, look at the website, but also look up the compendium document, and it's a companion piece. I think Andy's posted it in the Q&A for you. It is an extraordinary piece of work, bringing together 600 papers, 25 workshops, and an extraordinary amount of work. So do check that out as well. We do have a few questions. I'm going to check with Andy. Andy's been scrolling through those and had a look. Andy, what are the questions that we'd like to bring to Jono? And thanks again, Jono. What would we like to ask him, Andy?
Firstly, I just wanted to say, Jono, I've muted you. We're getting a bit of echo from your microphone, so you'll probably have to alt-tab back to Microsoft Teams to unmute yourself. Feel free to stop sharing that slide, and then you'll be able to change it. And when you're ready, one of the first questions we got was around the risk to waterways from roads and trails. Jono, do you have any research or learnings, I guess, surrounding that you'd like to share? Oh, sorry, you're on mute still. Apologies. It'll just be a moment, guys. So if you escape from your presentation, you'll be able to bring up Teams again.
How are we?
Yeah, you're good. You're good.
Okay. Yeah, look, sediment from tracks and trails is, you know, a really big issue, especially in upland streams. There's a lot of clogging of the cobble sediments there, which are often spawning sites or habitat sites. And even filling in holes and some of the deeper sections of water downstream as well. So that's certainly an issue. And I've worked on some of the forestry roads, and yeah, look, if we could stop some of that sediment coming in, that'd be great.
Beautiful. And on a similar note, I guess things flowing into the streams and affecting freshwater ecology. One of our listeners is curious about how pesticides such as Roundup are entering our catchments, and how is that impacting freshwater biota?
Yeah, look, there hasn't been a lot of work done on Roundup. I was talking to, with the recent controversy, I was talking to some of the EPA friends. They're not so concerned about this. There haven't really been fish kills or anything like that that have been attributed to Roundup. Some of the other pesticides there have been in the past, or herbicides. It doesn't come up as one of the top 10 issues that we're dealing with, but obviously we would like it not to be there.
Yeah, great, thank you. Around what you're talking about with the traditional owners and Aboriginal ownership of the land and how we're working and collaborating with them, are there any plans for ARI to work with traditional owners on eels or other native fish over in Victoria?
Yeah, well, look, that's already happening, and I should have mentioned the eel work. Wayne and some of our other staff have been working with the Gunditjmara people down at Conda, over quite a few years now. I think that work, the initial contacts probably started about, at least 5 or 6 or maybe even more years ago, and they're integrally linked to that eel satellite tagging project at the moment. So that's a very collaborative project. There's some Dutch researchers, there's Wayne, there's the Gunditjmara people, and you know, this is new stuff. Satellite tags haven't been used on fish, smaller fish, much before. They're used on sharks and marine species. And so look, there's a really integrated approach there. Prior to that, we also worked with Yorta Yorta on some of the work up in Barmer, and also turtle work up there as well, so with Katie Howard. So look, we're looking for opportunities all the time, and you know, as relationships build and as skills build, you know, I'm sure that's going to progress. And of course, my work across the Murray-Darling Basin has been heavily involved with all sorts of you know, Indigenous groups.
Yeah, great, really good stuff. Someone's asked about habitat restoration and any sort of good resources you could direct them to. Do you have any advice on that, Jono?
Do some Googling around and you'll find plenty of stuff. Fish Habitat Network is one. For some of the other information, Native Fish Australia have got some other information. Read the compendium, read those two papers. A bit of a slow read, but the second one, with what we need to do, what the priorities are, is 30 dot points. So that's a start for you. Catchment Management Authority, sorry, is the other one. Work with those. Have a look at their websites as well. ARI website.
Yep, cool. Thank you. I've got a question here about trout cod in Sevens Creeks and in the lower Goulburn, Ovens and Murray. Are they distinct genetic populations? This question might be a little bit too specific, but I guess it's around the connectivity of those areas for trout cod.
Well, we'd always hope those areas would be connected. The Murray and the lower Goulburn are. Seven Creeks sort of is if you take larval drift going downstream, but it's a long way. There's been some stocking in the mid Goulburn as well, but only in small numbers. And then the Ovens River Reach is connected a little bit through the Murray as well. And in fact, some of those stocked fish have actually gone up to the Kiewa and to Wodonga Creek, for example, as well. I haven't got a concern about the genetics. I think the genetics is pretty much okay amongst all of those sites. And having said that, trout cod aren't the greatest movers of all time either. So they're sort of used to being in isolated. But we obviously, when things are connected, it reduces your risk. So if one little bit of the jigsaw puzzle gets wiped out for some reason, it can get recolonised. So that's why we're so you know, heavily involved in the connectivity through Fishways.
Thanks, Jono. I've got a question. This comes up, I guess, from a lot of our ARI Legacy seminars, and it's around how do people get involved from with a career in aquatic science, from a graduate student or just trying to get experience. Do you have any advice on that?
Yeah, don't listen to your careers advisor. My careers advisor told me I was mad. There were no jobs and there was no money in doing fish or fisheries research. I ignored all of that, and here 40 years later I'm still there. So look, it's difficult. You need to study. You need that outdoor sort of aptitude, I guess. A science degree, you know, get into the biologies, get into ecology. Also join other organisations like Native Fish Australia, like the Australian Society for Fish Biology. You need qualifications these days. Very few of our scientists get employed these days without a PhD. Even our tech staff have degrees or diplomas or something like that. So it's the study route, and if you've got the drive and the interest, just explore every you know, avenue you can. Use your connections through ARI, through catchment management people, through other people that are working with fish, and just get as many runs on the board as you can. Go fishing.
Thank you, Jono. I guess follow your passion is a bit of a message there. So thank you once again. I'm going to close it off now and say thank you to you again. Thank you for everybody coming online today to listen to your talk. Thank you for the people who posted questions and comments, including those about fashion. We're going to have a bit of a fashion revolution now and bring back paisley shirts, I think. And I'd like to perhaps, instead of me saying what a fabulous work ARI has done as this, I might just quote from Stu Little, who's posted in the Q&A here, a really terrific comment that is just wonderful. Stu has said, "I cannot stress enough the amazing contribution of the ARI Aquatic Ecology team to the improved management of water and native fish in the Murray-Darling Basin over many decades. Thank you, ARI." So thank you, ARI. Thanks, Jono. Thanks everybody for being here. And our next and last seminar in the ARI Legacy series is on the 23rd of November, when we look at the shifting role of people in our ecological equations, and I'm going to deliver that one. So I hope to see you then. Please look up the ARI site for recordings if you got sidetracked during this one or you want to send it on to somebody else. Thanks once again. Thanks, Andy, for helping us with all the tech. Thanks, everybody, and take care, keep well, and enjoy the 25Ks. See you.